good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our Wednesday live stream piano hour with myself, Christopher Daigan, coming to you from my home in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. And if you're living in this part of the world, you might be even surprised to see us. We've been having some rather extreme weather. Tonight's session is about the aspirations and hopes of a honeymoon couple, you might like to say, who were aspiring to have a blissful time in sunny Spain, and instead they got a rather wet welcome, and apparently the wettest winter of the century in 1838. And today we had, I think, in this part of the world, in KZN Midlands, one of the most severe hailstorms I've ever seen. Had really hail the size bigger than golf balls, somewhere between a golf ball and a tennis ball, which went on for quite a while, and then it disappeared, and now it's come back. And in fact, there's thunder, so if you hear a mighty clap of thunder, it would be just absolutely appropriate for this evening's concert or this evening's session. It's more of a discussion or a story I'm hoping to tell you this evening rather than a concert. And an odd clap of thunder would be absolutely appropriate and in keeping with the story itself. So this evening's session devoted to the story of Chopin in Majorca. So often when I'm talking about Chopin's music and I mention the idea that Chopin went to the island of Majorca of Spain in terms of seeking not a remedy, but an opportunity for respite for his health, his very poor breathing. And everyone says, oh, wonderful. Yes, they know the story. Chopin went to Majorca with George Sand. They were lovers and they had this fabulous time together, and how wonderful it must have been. Well, this is going to tell you something about the truth of that story and a little more detail out of it, because as romantic as it might sound, it probably wasn't such a great deal after all. It was one of those holiday coupons they probably wished they would have not cashed in on. So hang around, we're going to be starting in a minute or two, and I'm going to be telling you all about Chopin and his music and about the trip that they had, and playing you a selection of pieces as well. I'm not quite sure if we're going to get through everything. As usual, I might be a little bit ambitious. If you are watching this program and enjoying it, please do support us. We really are counting on your support. There are many people who are watching it, and I'm very aware that obviously our subscriber base is dwindling. There's this idea of donor fatigue, which I realize is a very real element, but it is certainly setting in, and we are needing your support to keep this project going. The last thing I want to do is actually to stop having free live streams and to put a gate on it. In other words, so that only people who subscribe or who pay a monthly or weekly amount will be able to see it. I realize there are a lot of people who are enjoying it. So please, if you are watching this, please do support us with either a minimum amount, and some people have been asking me, well, what would be an appropriate amount? Well, for me, the usual fee for a concert ticket is somewhere between 50 and 100 rand. So if you are watching 6 or 8 of these a month and you're able to put 600 or 800 rand a month towards our project, that of course is a huge help. It's been great fun, but it's also an incredible amount of work, and this is making it possible for me to survive. Normally I do about 10 live concerts in a month, and I've done no more than 4 in the past 8 or 9 months due to the COVID restrictions. So I am have moved this whole project online, and I really don't want to make it a paying for entity, but we really do need your support from everyone who is watching to keep it free and available for those who are able to help us. So it is 6 o'clock. I'm going to dive straight into this program. Chopin in Majorca is the title of this evening's session, telling you the story of Chopin and George Sand on their trip to the Spanish island of Majorca. So just to give you a little bit of background first about Chopin, because I always talk about him, and it's always useful to know exactly what the details and the story of it is. Chopin's father, interestingly, was born in France. He was a French national. He went to Poland at the age of 16, and he taught as a tutor some quite aristocratic families. And he ended up then teaching at the university, the Lyceum in Warsaw itself. And despite the fact that he always spoke French at home, he was very devoted when he married. He married a traditional Polish woman and had children, including Frederick his son, a very talented young musical son, he always emphasized and kept the element of the devotion to the Polish culture and spoke Polish language at home. And so the mother's influence with her traditional Polish culture was very influential and a very important part of their life. But at the same time, they mixed in very educated, in an educated environment. He was coming from France, a very educated man. He was very adept. He was a musician himself. He played the piano and played the flute, gave the young composer his first lessons. And so this interesting combination of a educated Frenchman as a father and a traditional Polish woman as a mother were two elements that were very much combined in their household. Frédéric Chopin himself, the young boy, showed incredible talent as a musician and entered the conservatoire at the age of 16. And from a very young age, Chopin was a very delicate young man, and his health always seemed to be quite frail. And that's something we'll come back to later on. So the opening piece that I'd like to play for you that gives you a sense of the national Polish pride is Chopin's interest in the traditional Polish dance, the Mazurka. Similar to a waltz, it has 3 beats in a bar, although the emphasis is more on the second or third as on the first beat, which is what you would hear in a waltz. And Chopin spent many summer holidays away in the countryside where he would have really encountered the traditional Polish music and Polish dance. And in fact, even I have something of this idea in my head and in my visuals. Growing up, we had a Polish family living next to us, in fact, and often when I would go to concerts, they would be involved in dancing these traditional Polish dances, and it was so incredibly exciting. I didn't even know the relevance to Chopin then, but they had beautiful costumes and this music was so exotic and so interesting and so vibrant. So this is a Majorca, a very well-known Majorca Opus 7 that Chopin composed as a young man. A brilliant piece of music that I'm sure you'll all recognize. And in the middle section, it also gives you a sense, there's a very unusual drone sound, which gives you a sense of the traditional Polish style, the unusual textures and unusual scales and unusual drones of the music. sense of Chopin's traditional Polish background and his upbringing. The young musician showed great promise and decided to go on tours to Western Europe, first of all to Berlin, and then subsequently decided in about 1830, a month before the Warsaw Uprising, to actually leave and further his career in France. Well, he's actually apparently on his way to England, but he ended up in Paris on his way there. And this, of course, is the last time he ever was in Poland. He never returned. He never saw his family again. He never was able to smell the soil or something. Or he always talked about the smell of the Polish soil, being part of the traditional Polish culture, embraced by the people as he had been as a young man, was something he never experienced. And this longing of being a musician in exile, longing for his homeland, is certainly something that fuels a lot of the intensity and the feeling, especially a feeling of loss and melancholy, that occurs in Chopin's music repeatedly. But Paris itself was a very, very exciting place for any musician, especially a young pianist. All the great pianists, it was the center of romantic pianism at the time. Franz Liszt, composers like Kalkbrenner and Thalberg were all battling it out, trying to attract audience. Paganini was playing the violin. It was really the center of the cultural universe at the time. And so Chopin came along, found himself incredibly inspired by this, and found his place. His public performances, even in his entire life, he never gave more than 30 large-scale public performances throughout his lifetime. But even in his days after arriving in Paris, he found that, or it was noted, critically noted, that his playing was not suited to large-scale concert halls. It was very delicate, it was very refined, full of...
Turn your lapel.
Full of, okay, perhaps you can hear me now. Okay, full of very great little subtle details, and so Chopin's music and Chopin's performance style was then much better suited to the small drawing rooms and salons where he spent a lot of his time performing. And instead of playing in large concert halls, he earned a living teaching and also selling his compositions. Now, at some point in about 1836, he met for the first time the George Sand, or her name, the Baroness Dudevant, born Aurora or Amantine Dupin. She had come from a very aristocratic family. Apparently, she had royal lineage to the German and Danish royal families, as well as being distantly related to Louis XIV. But apparently her mother was a commoner, which of course was apparently was a bit of a problem. So she married the Baron Dudevant and became the Baroness Dudevant. They had two children, Solange and Maurice, young daughter and son. But shortly after that, they separated. They were legally separated, but not divorced. Now, she took the name of George Sand as a name not only to write under, but also it gave her a whole new identity. She was quite, I wouldn't say, well, she did shock contemporary Parisian society of the day. She wore men's clothing, and apparently this was not entirely uncommon, although one has to request specific legal permission from the police at the time in order to do this. And this might have been done for reasons of comfort, or she felt it was much easier for her to get around, for comfort and for durability of the clothes, and also for her general ease of movement. But the one thing it did do, apart from being dressed in trousers and waistcoats and coats and a top hat, it also gave her easy access into many different places that women were not allowed at that time. The real thing that shocked society at the time was that she smoked a cigar and tobacco in public. Now, this, of course, was a big shock. And you can imagine at the time this was quite a figure. The first time that she heard Chopin, probably at one of these fashionable drawing room salon environments, Chopin was not impressed by her at all. She was less than 5 feet tall, large, round eyes, dumpy, and he said he found her repulsive first occasion they met. But certainly George Sand had her eye on Chopin, and after a number of years, it wasn't a love at first sight at all. A number of years, she was completely overwhelmed after meeting him several times, and was fascinated not only by his this very fragile, frail personality and his delicate way, beautifully dressed, beautifully turned out, but his incredible playing, his incredible style of playing. They said that Liszt played like the devil himself, but Chopin played like the angels. And this idea that Chopin was angelic from another world, that he produced something which was so unheard of at the time and so rapturously fascinating, was incredibly exciting. And they began a relationship. And I'm going to play for you now a waltz in A flat, composed around this time, in fact, that they first met, and really reflecting something of this Parisian salon environment where Chopin would have been playing, invited to play and attended by a small number, a small environment, a small number of people, but only the wealthy, the baronesses, the princes, princesses, the great artists, poets of the time would have gathered, and they would have been absolutely enraptured by Chopin's incredible playing. So I'll play for you at this point the waltz in A flat, opus 34. The Beautiful Waltz in A-flat, opus 34, a piece of music that exhibits the grace, the elegance, the suave freedom of a very comfortable, confident composer playing to a fashionable drawing room environment. And I think that really, I mean, can you imagine being at a party and you hear the composer, the pianist, playing this music for the very first time? I mean, how can you not be completely enraptured by that? So George Sand herself was a respected novelist, highly respected novelist of the time, and in her own day was highly regarded as on the equal with authors like Victor Hugo. And her background and the fact that she had, not divorced, but separated for her husband, had, as I say, gave her freedom into many different environments and to move around. And she had several lovers along the way between leaving her husband and meeting Frédéric Chopin at this point. So they decided that they were going to elope. Chopin's health was not the best. He really was suffering from, his breathing was suffering, and the cold winter of the French capital, Paris, was approaching, and they decided to go somewhere really exotic. And they went to a rather faraway place, the island off the coast of Spain of Majorca. Now, this was quite an exotic place. This was not somewhere that everyone just happened to go to, but certainly the weather would have been warmer, the climate would have been drier, and not as harsh as the winter they were expecting at home in Paris. They set off, and interestingly enough, the details, I mean, interesting to see how this happened. Chopin traveled by stagecoach. They set off separately at first by stagecoach for 3 days and nights, and met at the town of Perpignan, which is a small village in France, not far from the Spanish border. And it's a place that I've actually been to, which is very interesting. And I have various anecdotes and various stories that actually this little village keeps cropping up in my conscience for various reasons. Anyway, they eventually went through Barcelona and embarked on a steamship, boiler ship, which had been built in Edinburgh only a year before this. And this boat went on twice weekly to the island of Majorca, and off they went on the 7th of November. Now, when they arrived, everything was absolutely bliss. Chopin described this as the most beautiful scenery. He saw beautiful blue skies, emerald green hills covered with olive trees and cypresses, and beautiful new interesting flora and fauna that he had never seen before, and was completely enticed by this. The air, he said, was heavenly. It was a heavenly experience. However, in the city or the town of Palma in Majorca, they struggled. First of all, the biggest problem was to find suitable accommodation, and no one seemed to really want to help them. And I think there might have been various reasons, or there have been various ideas put forward to this. First of all, here is a woman who arrives with 2 children, not with her husband, very conservative Catholic society they arrive in, and they're looking for accommodation together. It wasn't something that the locals were terribly welcoming and were frowning upon this idea. Chopin, they eventually found accommodation and did stay in an apartment or at a villa which they found, and the weather turned rather nasty. It started to rain, and Chopin's health deteriorated immediately. The local doctor arrived and declared the first signs of tuberculosis in Chopin, and by legal requirement he was required to inform the local authorities of this. Of course, now everyone was up and armed, and the owner of the villa forced the couple to leave along with their children, to burn the entire contents, furniture, bedding of the house, whitewash the walls, and sent them the bill to pay for it, and were asked to leave town. So here their holiday, which was really starting off on a very good note for the first maybe few days, turned rather sour very quickly. And the only accommodation they could find was in the nearby village of a place called Valdemosa on the hill, about 20 kilometers right up on the hillside, in an abandoned monastery. And here they moved into a cell And I say a cell, it's called a cell, but I've actually seen photographs of this. This is now a museum site, one of the museums devoted to the composer's life. And it's more quite a beautiful set of rooms, stone certainly, but with magnificent views over the valley, but just incredibly difficult to get to and very, very high up in the mountains. During this time now, Chopin described his room that he was in as a vertical coffin, and they weren't terribly happy there. It was incredibly difficult to get to. They were very far away. It was cold. George Sand wrote about how the eagles, they were so up in the mountains, you could see the eagles and vultures attacking and coming out of nowhere and just swallowing up and taking the small birds right outside a window. It was actually quite a harsh and quite a wild environment for them to be in. During one of these winter weeks, as the rain got worse and things declined, the atmosphere declined and the weather got worse and worse and worse, it, as I say, turned out to be the wettest winter of the century. One of the evenings, on the outing, Chopin was left at home to carry on working. And when they came back, they found Chopin in great despair. They had been caught in a rainstorm and they came back very, very late at night. And Chopin feared, in fact, that they were all dead and had been washed away in a landslide or simply fallen off the face of the cliff. Such was the precarious environment they were in. But at this point, apparently, he was writing a piece of music that George Sand, in her memoirs, pointed out had a unique aspect of a repeated note. A unique idea of one note being repeated again and again and again, which she said reminded her, or which she felt that he had been inspired by the dripping of rain, the incessant rain in his music. And he wasn't very enthralled about this. He said, no, this is not what it really should be. He was quite appalled the fact that such a external advice, external element might have found his way in such a straightforward way into his music. But nevertheless, the story has certain relevance, and it's a very interesting point, a very useful story, because of that, the inspiration behind this raindrop prelude. And so I'm going to play several of these preludes for you now. This is a set of pieces that Chopin had decided to work on during this time. He had arranged with the publisher in Paris, Camille Pleyel, who was also sending him a piano. He had arranged for a small piano to be sent to the island for him to work on, and which didn't arrive. And Pleyel had also organized for an advance fee to be paid in exchange for a set of 24 preludes. And these are the preludes, opus 28. Chopin had written probably one or two of them before he even left. He took a portfolio of compositions with him. And during this time, he was working on these preludes. And they're an incredibly varied selection of music. They are really one of his most challenging pieces to perform because of all of these pieces are so short, or some of them lasting 30 or 40 seconds, the longest being only 3 or 4 minutes. But together they create an entire universe of moods, of colors, of fractions, of moments that are grouped together by a very organized key scheme, and which really represent, I think, a unique atmosphere of everything about Chopin's life at that point. The hope, the desire, but yet at the same time the impending, and I can hear the thunder in the background rumbling through, the impending darkness that he knew, not only with his health, but possibly also with his relationship with George Sand, that was on the horizon already, even after the first months. So I would like to play for you from the set of preludes 2 or 3 of the short, well-known ones. I don't generally play these, but they are very well-known pieces in E minor, A major, and C minor. And then straight after that, the famous Raindrop Prelude, as I say, the piece of music that George Sand described as being inspired by this incessant dripping of rain, although Chopin denied it. And you'll hear this note throughout the piece of music. And as I always say, in the central piece, this is the center point of the 24 preludes, it seems to me that this is the moment that Chopin's really hoping for the bliss and experiencing the doom and the first signs of the tragedy that he sees on his horizon. the celebrated Raindrop Prelude from the Preludes, opus 28, 24 Preludes, the principal work that Chopin wrote during his time in the island of Majorca at the abandoned monastery in Val de Mosa. So, interestingly enough, as I say, the cell which they resided in was decided on, well, should I say, there was a dispute because, in fact, until quite recently, until the year of 2011, there were two cells, there were two rivals at this monastery who both claimed that, in fact, Chopin had stayed at their particular establishment which they had created, a Chopin museum around it, and they had a piano to prove it. And there seems to be an incredible complication. This piano that Chopin ordered from Pleyel only arrived a few weeks before he eventually left. And he had another piano from a local piano maker which was apparently dreadful, and that's what he tried to compose with and tried to write with. But one cell decided that they had the place that the Chopin and Sand had resided in, and right next door was somebody else. And only after the year 2011 did a local judge decide that from the sketches that Sand's son had made, the sketches that he had made would only have been possible of the surrounding countryside from the one particular cell, and also in that cell the piano which was from supposedly the piano that Chopin had played on and that Chopin had received eventually was the correct piano, whereas the piano that was in the other cell that people claimed and had been acknowledged by many people, many great musicians, in fact over the last 200 years, had posed very grandly with this other piano, that this was Chopin's piano, turned out that it in fact was only manufactured about 10 years after Chopin had died. So now there's one official museum and one official place that is allowed to charge for visitors to go and see in fact where Chopin spent this time. Now this experience was not, of course, all... Oh my goodness, here is Lucy. Here are Lucy. Now you're wanting to be picked up, I'm sure. So Lucy needs an appearance, yes. You also want to go. Do you want to go to Majorca? Do you want to go and see? Do you think there are things that you can go and chase there? Do you think there's something that you can go and find and chase a ratty maybe? Or a duck? You like to pick up ducks. Lucy has this amazing ability. I don't think she's a real dachshund. I think she's a cross between something else, and she has this very soft mouth, as it's called apparently. And when you throw something, she picks it up and gently brings it back to you, which is a very un-dachshund-like behavior. Most dachshunds I know would pick it up and try and kill it. You're very photogenic. Look how good you look on the picture. There we go. Off you go. Now you've had your own show. You've been acknowledged. Right, that is Lucy. Where was I? I can't remember what I was talking about. So the trip, obviously, the excursion they had was obviously an amazing period for Chopin to compose as well, and he wrote a number of pieces of music there, including several mazurkas, the great Polonaises, Opus 40, which I'm going to play for you now, and the second Ballade, which is a very fantastic and very grand work, and as well as the third Scherzo, which is a piece of music I'm hoping to end this evening's program off with. During this time No, Lucy, you can't bark. No, in your basket, come, in your basket. No. You're normally very good about this. Okay. Off she goes. During this time, doctors were called in. Chopin's health was, of course, failing, getting worse and worse, and the incredible rains and the cold and freezing cold and the lack of facilities to actually comfort themselves were making his health just worse and worse and worse. And eventually doctors were called in, and he, in his very humorous and wry way, Chopin said, 3 doctors came to see me. The first one said I was dying, the second one said I was about to die, and the third one said I was already dead. But certainly Chopin's health was now an area of grave concern, and George Sand remarked on more than one occasion to people that in fact she had now gone from having this companion in her life to having a third child. Chopin needed such looking after, and she sometimes called him my fragile little corpse. They'd eventually decided to leave after several months. In February the following year, they decided to leave Majorca, and the incredible journey down the hill through these incredibly narrow roads that were hardly roads, they were paths which they had to find their way through, and left Majorca and ended up recuperating in Barcelona and Marseille. And what's very interesting is that George Sand, in her novels, of course, full of willingness to respond, wrote a rather unfortunate memoir about this experience, and had the most dreadful things, as always, and as we'll see later on, to say about the local people from Palma and Majorca. So one of the pieces that Chopin did compose, as I said, is the Polonaise Opus 40. This is really a very robust and outgoing piece of music, sometimes called the military Polonaise, and it really expresses Chopin's great national pride again in a very grand and spirited way. A Polish dance, the very strict 3 beats in a bar, but with a very particular rhythm, and in Chopin's hand it becomes very magnificent and grand composition. in A major, opus 40, one of the compositions that Chopin wrote, along with the very famous preludes, opus 28, 24 preludes, opus 28 in Majorca. Those preludes are a piece of music that, as I say, I've never played the entire set. It's an incredibly difficult piece of music to learn and to play because it's actually 24 completely different pieces of music, and some of them are so slight that to play a composition like that where the moods change so radically from one to another, there's no repetition of material, there's no repetition of the music, it's just completely one uniquely separate idea after another, but incredibly exciting and a complete universe in one piece of music. It's a great project I'd like to work on one day. So having left Majorca, Chopin and George Sand continue their relationship for approximately the next 10 years. They never live together, they live in separate apartments, sometimes actually next door to each other, and they continue spending most of their time together, and particularly in the summer at George Sand's summer house, Nohant. And these periods are really where Chopin is able to focus on his composition and really focus on his work. And George Sand describes these moments, not only from all the time that she had known him, how he composes, improvising at the piano. She said she would hear this improvisation at the piano of the most magnificent music, just flowing. He would just be making it up. But then he would try and write it down, and he would try and refine these ideas and try and turn these ideas into compositions that are more structured and more organized. And he would agonize over them for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time, crossing things out, throwing them away, scratching, breaking his pens, and eventually starting to rewrite one bar at a time exactly the way he had done it 6 weeks earlier. And in no comparison, but I'm very aware of that idea that when the improvisations, which I often do on these live streams, how easily when you're in the moment and focused in the actual physical act of piano playing, things can happen quite spontaneously, things happen quite easily, and the music can come and new ideas come to you quite magically from you're not quite where they are coming from. But everything seems to happen in a very spontaneous way. But then to go back and to try and even write that down or try and define that idea is like catching something that you can never pin down. So I can understand Chopin's frustration with that. But during these days at the summer house, also there were numerous visitors, again, friends, artists, collaborators. There was a general atmosphere of great camaraderie and a great hospitality that went on. And I think more than anything, George Sand offered Chopin not only encouragement and a sense of security, protecting him from the world maybe even, but also financial support. And this support that he didn't have to constantly pedal out his musical compositions in order to survive, that he had someone to protect him or someone to look after him, or he was at least embraced or held by an entity, by someone, I think was the incredible gift that she actually gave him. Because during those years, during the 10 years that he was with George Sand, he composes really almost the bulk of his great compositions. Not even his great compositions, the vast output, a large section of it happens during these 10 years. And as their interaction, the relationship between them breaks down, Chopin started coming to blows with her over siding with her children. Her son was growing older and was starting to sort of challenge Chopin as wanting to dominate, being the man about the house. And Chopin took her daughter's side in an argument over money when she got engaged. And George Sand was not very taken by this at all, and the relationship soured. And in the last 3 years that they were together, he only produced a few smaller compositions. The following year, he produced only 3 short mazurkas. the only thing he composed the whole year. And the last year they were together, he composed one work. It was the sonata in B minor, but that's one composition. That's all he produced, and he was overcome with anguish and anxiety. One can imagine that this relationship and this ability, this gift or this platform that she had provided for him to protect him, especially during these summer periods, was now vanishing, and he was out on his own once again, and that his health was just getting worse and worse and worse. Now, contemporary medical analysis of his condition, from what people can ascertain, really now point towards a genetic disorder like cystic fibrosis that actually Chopin suffered from his whole life, rather than the commonly assumed consumption or tuberculosis, as it's now called, which people generally acknowledge as what Chopin died of in the end, that this cystic fibrosis or some sort of degenerative disease is something that he suffered from a very young age. Even when he was a young man and a young boy, he always was very fragile and had problems with his lungs and problems breathing. And in the last years of his life, the relationship broke down completely. George Sand, in her usual, a few months before actually they split, she wrote a novel, and she did this apparently on several occasions. She wrote novels that revealed all the secrets and all the inner goings on about her friends and everyone in society that she knew. And in this particular novel, she cast herself, she based a character on herself, and a character which was obviously based on Chopin himself, and cast him as a very sickly, fragile man. And then he was asked to proofread this novel, which I don't quite know how that would have worked. So he was very aware of what she was writing about and putting him in a very, very bad light. As I said, she called him his fragile corpse. It ended rather badly, and they decided not to have anything to do with each other and never saw each other again. In the last months of his life, Chopin went off to England. He played in England, did a few concerts there at the invitation of one of his students, Jane Stirling, England and Scotland, and returned to Paris and died in 1839. No, I'm getting my dates mixed up. 1849, if I'm not mistaken. Interestingly, his popularity had waned in the last years of his life. He was well known as a teacher, as I mentioned in one of the previous sessions. One of the students that traveled from England was Emma Wedgwood, the granddaughter of Joseph Wedgwood of the Wedgwood Empire, who married her cousin Charles Darwin. And she was one of many students who used to come to Paris, and Chopin would have taught there. Chopin's funeral itself, however, was a very big affair. It was delayed by 2 weeks in order to organize it, and only ticketed people with tickets, were allowed to enter the church and attend the service itself. There were over 3,000 people who arrived for the service that were turned away, his final funeral service, and the streets of Paris were lined with mourners. Chopin's heart was removed from his body at his request and taken back the following year in 1850 by his sister to Poland, where it still resides in the church in Warsaw. And it's an incredibly poignant life. I think there's something very interesting and fascinating about the way that he somehow knew that everything he expressed in his music, which is such a universal feeling, such a universal expression, so magnificently put together, really brings about so many commonly held thoughts and feelings about loss, about longing, about wishing, about a hope for something that is quite magical and something slightly beyond always where we are. And I think that's something that's incredibly personal, fascinating, and intriguing about his music. I'd like to end this evening's session, as I said, with one of the compositions that he composed during these times on the island of Majorca, the Opus 39 Scherzo number 3. This is one of 4 scherzos that he wrote, and they're all very dramatic and quite brilliant pieces of music. They really represent the most outgoing driven elements of Chopin's music, not the gentle, wavering, watery notions, but something quite edgy and quite strong. And this particular piece is always a challenge to play, not only from a technical point of view, but also from an interpretive point. I'm going to have to be challenged a little bit further to try and bring it into the surrounds of such an intimate situation at home and also via this live stream medium. But I hope you enjoy this. It's a scherzo number 3 in C sharp minor. grand and vigorous note there, bringing an end to this evening's session of Chopin and Majorca. One of the pieces, the Scherzo number 3, that he composed during that time in Majorca. It's a place that I'd like to visit. I'd like to go and see that cell for myself. It sounds like it's terrible, a cell in an abandoned monastery, but apparently I've spoken to people who've been there and seen pictures of it, and it's actually not so bad after all. But nevertheless, I'm sure during Chopin's time, and in 1838 or 39, in the wettest winter of the century in the island, it was particularly unpleasant. And in fact, speaking of wet, it's pouring with rain outside again. So thank you for joining us. Please look after yourselves, stay safe. On Saturday night, we'll have a very unique and brilliant program with 2 guest artists. We are having the trio, the Dumki trio, with the trio Sophia. We'll be joined by a lovely violinist, Radlitza, and a lovely cellist, also Radlitza, and 2 musicians from the KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic Orchestra, and we'll be playing Dvorak's Dumki trio, and as well as having just a general chat about the music. So please join us then. Please do support us. We are really relying on everyone who's watching to support us with either buying a ticket to these presentations or a weekly or a monthly donation to keep the costs, to keep me working, to keep everything going, and to keep our program running. We hope you are enjoying it. We are having great fun, and it's very exciting and a great opportunity to meet you through this medium, but we do need your support as well. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to play out with a little improvisation, and we look forward to seeing you on Saturday.